Welcome back to another episode of The Loca Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and today I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health counselor, to cover Jungian theory and how these themes help explain the development of personality. So, if you guys have not heard of Carl Jung, you're living under a rock. He's definitely one of the most prolific psychoanalysts, and his themes, whether you maybe don't know him, you've heard of these themes. And especially in the past few years, I feel like they've really taken off. If you've listened to anything from Jordan Peterson, he weaves a lot of Jungian theory into his just talks and all of that. And I'm just really excited to go through this because I know both of us really enjoy his work. And like I said, I think a lot of people know about it, but they maybe don't know the specifics or where it stems from. So yeah, there's so much. And I mean, literally we could have like so many different things to cover here.
Right.
But I wanted to do just kind of like an overview of a lot of his main concepts and how they can relate to our listeners.
Yeah. And so what I want you guys to understand with this particular podcast is this is kind of a introduction and an explanation as to how personality develops and how we develop into the human beings that we are presently today. And more importantly, if you'd like to change the human being you are today, what's the process for doing that? And to me, Jungian theory is one of the most complete aspects of how a person develops. It's not just kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy where it's like addressing your thoughts and beliefs. This is a little bit more of the entire person. And so obviously Carl Jung is the founder of analytical psychology. One of the three things that he kind of breaks down when it comes to understanding Jungian theories, there's three basic concepts to understand kind of how the psyche works. Number one, there's the conscious, then there's the personal unconscious, and then there's the collective unconscious. Okay, so there's three realms, and I'm going to go through what each of them are. So when somebody says bring something to consciousness, to awareness, right, what we're really talking about is your field of awareness. These are all the experiences that you've had that you're aware of. And this experience, what is conscious to you is what develops the ego. So all of the experiences that you have in your life that you're aware of, from birthday parties to deaths to milestones, all of those things are kind of encompassed in your conscious awareness. The second one, which is the personal unconscious, which is particular to each individual and their lives. These are the thoughts that we're not aware of, and they've been repressed due to their disturbing nature. Okay? Now, how and why they've been repressed? There's a number of factors: social, cultural, economical, political, even internal. Things that you've thought, things that have happened to you, things that you've experienced that are just kind of disturbing in nature. And so oftentimes they get repressed. And then there is the collective unconscious. Now this is the deepest part of our unconscious. If you kind of look at this as like levels just going down deeper and deeper, like into the sea. And this is for Jung, these are genetic and inherited. These are not aspects of your conscious self or your life experiences. This is where the archetypes are found. And when you think about Carl Jung or Jungian philosophy, archetypes are a big part of the explanation of the human being and the personality. And so what I mean by inherited is, and I'm going to get to what some of these things are inherited like they are specific types of behavioral patterns. Carl Jung was heavily influenced and studied a lot of religion, mythology, symbology, and he started to recognize similar patterns even within dreams, like schizophrenics, right, who have had no relationship to each other, would identify the same symbols and theories and themes running, consistent throughout their dreams. And when you start to look at religions, when you break down religions, even though these cultures many years ago never interacted with each other, they all had very similar themes and patterns. And so
it really is interesting when you start to look at different teachings. And I've started to do that more on like a personal level, just out of interest. And all of the things that are supposedly so different are really the same thing.
I like the Trinity.
It's just like they are, different religions, argue about different things with like rules and this and that. And then like spirituality is its own whole kind of thing. And then there's the whole like mindfulness, consciousness group, right? And the meditation people. There's all these different things that are so seemingly different. But when you really look at like that thread that goes between all of them, it's the same kind of stories, the same ideas. Now, of course, they are played out in different ways, But it's really interesting how a lot of the archetypes come back to the same message. And think about like any movie that we like, you know what I mean? Like there's always these archetypes, there's always these symbols, whether you recognize it or not. Like that is why we like those types of things. And like some are more overt than others. Like obviously Star Wars is extremely overt in the sense of like, the dark side and all of these different things, and like the good and the bad in all of us. But what's cool is like, especially with Star Wars, is like sometimes you like flip, you're like, wait, who is the good guy? Who is that? Like, I mean, sometimes it's pretty obvious, but other times it's not. And that's what's interesting, because it really is like how we think as human beings. So anyways, I'll get off on that tangent.
No, it's okay. So having a basic understanding of these are three realms that we really need to have a grasp on. The consciousness, which is your field of awareness based off your experiences. The personal unconscious, which is particular to each individual lives, but is comprised of the repressed aspects of your life. And then the collective unconscious, which is the deepest part, which is basically like one of the best ways to think about it is you know how you store things to the cloud on your phone? Like it's just this, no? Yeah, you do, like on your iPhone?
I don't.
Oh, you don't? Oh,
no.
You don't personally?
I personally don't.
The collective unconscious is like this big cloud that you're allowed to tap into.
I always ruin every analogy.
You do. I appreciate that. You keep me on my toes. But the various archetypes that would be found in the collective unconscious, to help further clarify this, would be things like the father, the mother, the wise old man, the hero, the trickster. Okay, these are all concepts and archetypes within the collective unconscious. And now there's like, even within those, there's subsections, right? Like you were talking about, so take, for example, the hero. Right now, the hero is one concept, right? One kind of category. But underneath that, there can be a bunch of different types of heroes and what heroes look like and who they are and what they represent. And so by that token, there can also be an infinite number of heroes. However, they all fall under the one category. So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, because we're not going to focus on those. What I am going to focus on are the four main archetypes that are consistent with Jungian theory, which is the self, the persona, the shadow, and then the combination of the anima or the animus. And I'm going to explain what those are. Now, I'm trying to describe this in a way that makes sense for people, because it's difficult without charts and graphs and being able to show images right now. So what I want you to think of is, picture in your mind a Venn diagram, right? And a Venn diagram, for those of us that don't remember what that is there's one big circle over here on the left, there's one big circle over here on the right, and in the middle is where they overlap. And in that overlap, for this approach, is where the self exists, okay? So on one side, you have, like, the self is the middle ground between the ego and the persona on one end, and then the shadow and the anima and animus on the other, okay? So the self is the middle. It's the middle ground. It's the connection between these two worlds. So let me explain what each of those little worlds are. So the ego is a conscious factor only, okay? And what I mean by that is it is partial, because it doesn't include, or it doesn't take into account, all the other aspects of conscious or unconscious awareness. Okay? It's not a total picture. So the ego consists of somatic, which is the body, and then it also consists of the psyche, which is the mind. And the mind, within the mind, there are conscious aspects and unconscious aspects. Okay? So the main purpose for the ego is to create individuality, right? Which is part of our consciousness. Does that make sense? Is that okay? I just want to make sure that I'm explaining this.
It's not necessarily ego as in like I have a big ego.
No.
So maybe expand on that a little bit. Because I think when people hear the word ego, they automatically go to that definition.
Yeah, I'm not talking about somebody who's like conceited or has a strong sense of like...
Strong sense of self. We're not even talking about that.
Right. Because you want to use the word self, like it's slightly different. This is just kind of like a culmination of all your worldly experiences in life, and
that are conscious,
that are
in your conscious awareness,
that are within your ability to understand and grasp. Yes. All right. The self,
and they're not suppressed like the unconscious.
Correct.
Which is from the beginning what we're talking about.
Correct. The self is the total of both the conscious and unconscious factors of yourself. Okay, that's a complete person. This is the goal of most of the time when I'm in therapy with people, is me working to help a person become complete. And they'll often hear me say to them, like, I want you to stop thinking about your life and you in terms of good or bad. And I want you to start thinking of yourself in terms of complete and incomplete. And so I'm working to help you become a more whole person. And by doing that, what I'm asking you to do is to take into account the parts of yourself that you don't really like, that you've actively repressed for most of your life, that you don't want to acknowledge or admit to, because these are creating motives and thoughts and energies within you that are causing you to act in certain ways. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Because the unconscious is what is driving your actions, essentially. And until you, to use a Jungian word, integrate that, then it will continue to guide your decisions and your thoughts, and you'll be confused by it, right? But it really is there. You just haven't explored it or tapped into it. Correct. Or you've just chosen to repress it. Maybe you felt it before, but you don't want to feel that because it is quite horrifying.
Yes.
So you continue to repress it, which only, I would probably say, makes worse. Right? Like the longer that you do that and the more that you push, it's kind of like anything. The more that you push, the more that it goes back the other way. So,
right. Yeah. And so for Jung to realize the self, he developed the concept of what was called individuation, right? Which is basically self-realization, which is the process of understanding both the conscious aspects of who you are and the unconscious aspects, right? And for some people, the difficulty is in them saying, well, if I'm unconscious of it, how can I be aware of it? Well, this is the point of therapy, of being introspective, etc. We're going to work on how to get there. So
I would say the reason most people say that is because they haven't sat with themselves to recognize those patterns. Because once you allow yourself the mental space to do that, it gets pretty obvious as to what is guiding that, right? And I mean, it might not be obvious initially or right away. It might take several years to realize that. But the only way you're going to recognize that is by allowing yourself to have that space. And part of that could be through therapy. Part of that could be through your own introspection. Part of that could just be learning, reading. Part of that could just be all of those things together. But I would say that it's the reason it's unconscious is because you're continuously pushing it there, and you have to allow yourself that space to recognize it. And literally, I know, like this, unless you give yourself that time and space, you won't ever see it. No,
you have to create the environment for you to see it, like first and foremost.
And that's uncomfortable.
It is.
But if you want to do this and you don't want to continue the same patterns, then at some point you have to do this.
So now I want to dive into the unconscious aspects. Is that okay? So I want to get into the unconscious realm. Kind of deals with a couple of key factors. Number one is the persona. Okay. So we're going to talk about the persona, the shadow, and the animus and anima. Okay. Which again, these are all kind of the disturbing influences on your ego.
So per his theory, the ego is the only conscious part of this Venn diagram, correct?
Yes, correct. It's on the one side. Okay. And the self is the bridge, is the gap between the unconscious and the ego. Okay. So what is persona? Persona, the best way to think about this, and you'll see it described if you've ever seen any lecture or read anything on him, is people often refer to as the masks that we wear. Okay, this persona exists on a basis for, it's a conformity archetype. Okay, what I mean by that is these are the various masks we wear depending on the situations that we're in or the roles that we're in. Right, so this can be who I am at the gym and versus who I am at my job versus who I am with my friends, who I am in public, or let's start looking at my roles, right? Because we're very different people depending on the role that we're in, right? So if I'm a father, that's one role. If I'm a husband, that's another role. My wife, if I'm a wife, if I'm a sister, if I'm an uncle, if I'm a brother, like you take on different aspects. And
so, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's not. It's designed for you to blend in, for you not to always stand out, and for you to conform, because otherwise you can be under tremendous amounts of stress all the time. But this is where the problem becomes, and this is where we start to repress things. Because by wearing these masks, by the personas existing, so what we're basically doing is I'm projecting a fake image of who I am. And so by doing this, it conceals my real self, okay? And it presents someone different to who I am in reality. So I'm not being my authentic self with every persona that exists. I've created personas that I think you want to see and the rest of the world wants to see that is tolerable and acceptable. And instead what I've done is I've kind of, in some ways, shamed my authentic version of who I really am. And what happens is when we please other people with our personas, it leaves our negative traits that contradict our real selves. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. This is where the shadow is created. Because now what we've done is everything that we've deemed not acceptable for everybody else to see gets stored in the shadow. And so it's this contradiction between who we are authentically versus who I show the rest of the world.
And to some degree, the reason I asked that, like, it's not always a bad thing, right? Because to some degree, you do have to play a different role depending on your situation, who you're with, all of that, right? Like, you have to. Like, we just did that podcast on the confrontation at work. Like, you're going to confront situations professionally very differently than you're going to confront them personally.
Yes.
But the farther that you deviate maybe from that, like, authentic self to have that persona is where the problems arise. Mm-hmm. Is that maybe a better interpretation? Or is that a correct interpretation?
Repeat what you just said.
So at some level, you're probably going to have some type of a persona, right? And different places call for different roles. Mm-hmm. But the problem arises when that persona is so different from your authentic self. Like if it's deviating so far, like, or the farther that it deviates from your authentic self, the more that you're going to repress things and put that into the shadow. Yeah. Correct? If it's a little bit out of it, because again, that's going to make sense, right? Like you at work is different than you at home, most likely, right? Yeah. It's not saying that that's like, now you're not being your authentic self, but you also, if you're deviating 100% from that, right? Or so far, then that's where you're going to run into those issues.
Yeah. And for some people, the personas exist as a way to exist in the world without always being the outcast, right? We might have really deep, deviant, dark thoughts, but we have to create masks in order to kind of fit in. And some people are able to do this very effectively. Like, you start looking at serial killers. You know what I mean?
I'm just thinking of so many memes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, keep them to yourself.
I'm not being my authentic self. Well, no, but I do bring that up because I think that, again, because maybe this is just the people that I like follow, study, all these different things. These concepts are woven in a lot, right? So authentic self comes up a lot. So I think when people hear that, they think that, well, I have to be 100% my authentic self at all times. Otherwise, I'm living a lie. And it's like, yes, but also maybe not, right? Like you are going to have a different role and a different persona in different situations, and that doesn't mean that you're not being your authentic self. It just means that you're in a different situation. Right. And I'm just trying to push back on that idea.
Every person is going to learn. Like if you want to be your authentic self in every situation, be prepared to alienate a lot of people. Right. For some of us, the idea, to me, more importantly, is to integrate the deeper levels of the unconscious motives into your complete self so that you're not ruled by them. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to project them in every situation.
And that's what I wanted to get out of this. That was what my question was, or my, I guess, probing was, because I think that comes up a lot. And I hear that over and over and over again. Like, just be your authentic self, show your authentic self. And yes, but also like there's a little bit more to that. There's more context to it than just be yourself at all times. Right.
And people wonder where or why some of these things start to come from. So do you remember when we did our attachment podcast? Mm-hmm. And I talked about how there was two basic fundamental needs that a person has, the need for attachment and the need for authenticity, right? And we talked about how we require attachments early in our life in order to survive, to function, to grow. But then at a certain point, we start to become authentic and voice our truths about the world. Well, what happens when the truths that I'm starting to speak about and espouse into the world threaten my attachment? Well, now I learn, because I still need to survive, to repress my authentic self, right? So that it doesn't threaten my attachment connections, and those begin to thrive. So I actively learn how to shut myself down, right? And I learn how to repress these things that I think are the truth. So this is where you start to see in psychology, some of this stuff starts to overlap and interplay between one another. So I want to get into the shadow. Now, for our newer listeners or people who are unfamiliar with this, the shadow is comprised of the repressed or suppressed aspects of the conscious self. So like what I was just talking about, consciously I'm aware of what my truths are, but I'm going to not share those truths because my attachment figures, or the people in my world, don't want to hear them, and I'll be outcast, or they won't like them, or I'll be judged. So I'm going to repress them. Okay. Now, To repress is kind of an unconscious thing. A lot of times things, like think of this in terms of trauma. People will repress a lot of things. To suppress something is essentially the same process, but done on a voluntary level, right? I know no one's going to like hearing what I have to say, or no one's going to really like these things, so I'm voluntarily not going to shut it. I'm aware that I'm suppressing something, versus a repression, which might be something that I've learned and I'm unaware of it, but I'm still shoving it down into the same place. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. To understand and be aware of the shadow, there must be a considerable moral effort to explore these aspects, these dark aspects of your personality, because they are both real and present. And I say moral because this is the space where morality is conflicting. And it's the parts of us that we don't want to admit exist, because we're very moral, righteous creatures, and it's very easy for us to stand in our soapboxes and pass judgment. But we're going to get to an example in a little bit as to how we kind of get around that. And so the shadow for many people is dealt with in one of four ways: denial, projection, transmutation, and integration, or integration, I should say. So what is denial? Denial is the refusal to accept or perceive painful facts that actually exist, period. It's just a complete denial that it's even there. Projection.
Would that be denial of
the shadow, the unconscious motives.
That like is within yourself, or denial that like, oh, somebody else can do that, I could never do that, but...
Yeah.
Or is that both?
Mm-hmm. How could somebody do those things?
But not seeing it, for not just necessarily denial for your own self.
It's denial that it exists within you.
Okay, yeah, that's a better way of putting it.
Okay. Projection. Projection is a common thing. You'll hear people talk about this a lot in very different contexts. And it's basically displacing one person's feelings onto another person. When we do this, we unconsciously change the world around us to replicate your own unknown face, the parts that you don't want to see, right? So by projecting it, I'm essentially forcing it unconsciously onto the world around me. Hence, kind of creating the environment to replicate what I'm unwilling to see within myself. Make sense? Or don't want to see.
What would be like a good example of that? Because we hear this all the time. You know, oh, that person's projecting.
I was afraid of being attacked, right? And so as a result, I don't allow my son to go anywhere in public with me because he's going to be attacked, right? Okay. I'm projecting my fears and insecurities and anxieties onto my son when he has no life experience with that. It wasn't his experience, it was mine. So I'm essentially creating a dangerous world for my son because my anxieties are being projected onto him. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Transmutation. This is a little bit more of a difficult one to kind of conceptualize, but these are empathic failures that a person experienced earlier in life, but are then later recognized and acknowledged and validated, usually through a therapist or some type of an analysis. Okay, so it's like coming full circle, so to speak. Like you're aware of where the deficits exist, and you're starting to process and work through them, and somebody else is acknowledging and validating them, right? So it's kind of like, it's a good scenario for some people to be in, to be able to acknowledge and validate the lack of response or growth that you've had in certain areas.
So this is kind of the first step to maybe working through this and integrating, right? Like first you're going to deny, which is of course no concept whatsoever that this could even exist. Mm-hmm. And then projecting is still not recognizing that because you are not aware of this, but you're simply projecting. But now this transmutation is the beginning process of integration. Is that a good way of
for
thinking
some
about
people?
It,
they
no?
don't. Well, kind of, right? Because you can be in denial and not project. You can project but not know that you're in denial. And so this is kind of like they're willing to admit these things exist and understand them, but not integrate them.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So not integrating quite yet.
And so integration is truly the process for which both the individual and the collective unconscious are integrated into the personality. where they're aware and functioning in a way that allows them to exist as a part of who they are. Right.
And I would say that this is the thing that we see the most, especially now, is, integrate your shadow work, all these different things. Like that is everywhere, all over social media, all over, psychology and for good reason. But I think a lot of people will just look at this as, I'm just going to, and I'm not knocking psychedelics whatsoever because I'm somebody who enjoys this as well. But people will just say, I'm going to take some psychedelics and integrate my shadow. And you're like, all right, are you just saying these words? Do you actually understand?
Yeah, they're just saying it.
That this is much, and those things can certainly happen, but there is a lot that also goes on behind the scenes. It's not just a easy word to throw around.
Right.
And I think that now it is one of those things, kind of like that authentic self. Like that example that I was sharing is because that comes up all the time. Well, if you're not being your authentic self, then just don't even do it. And it's like, well, do you want to have a job? I mean, do you want to there's certain times where it's like you have to adjust yourself to the situation. And the same thing here is like shadow work, integrating your shadow sounds really fun. But are you actually prepared for this? Because I don't think that a lot of people are really prepared to meet that. Because I think, at least for me, once I started to recognize these things, it starts that very nihilistic route and that path of okay, if this is inside of me and this is inside of everybody else, then what's the point? And then how am I going to you basically are in the deep end of this, and it's how do I get out of this abyss if you actually recognize the magnitude of it? And I think that is what's hardest about this, which is why it might be useful to explore these things with a therapist or in some kind of guided capacity, because you can find it and then get stuck. And then it's well, was that useful, or was it better to be completely in denial? Which I don't know what's better or worse.
Ignorance is bliss.
It can be.
Yep.
And there's some people who, will never even think about these things in any capacity.
There's people who turned off this podcast a long time ago.
Yeah, they're
anybody still listening is really interested in this, and they were whatever. You're
super invested and super weird like us. This is all my favorite shit. So selfishly, I wanted us to do this podcast. Maybe 2.5 other people are listening at this point, but hey. If you're here, welcome.
Flame emojis. Fire emojis.
Fire, Rick's favorite. It's just all you just
blow it up with fire emojis.
I can't. But this is, I think, it sounds exciting. You know what I mean? And it's been made to sound exciting. But it's are you actually ready? Because this really is a recognition that the awful things that you're judging other people for are all things that you're capable and have probably thought of, and maybe you haven't allowed yourself to recognize that, or you've felt it for a second and you're whoa, and you just push that away instead of actually feeling that.
Yeah, and this is not something that I go to 3 or 4 sessions and it's done. This is a lifelong process. So learning these skills and evaluating and exploring the depths of this stuff is something that we do throughout our life. It's not just I did it once and I'm done, I worked through my shadow. No, it doesn't work like that. Yeah.
There could be certainly a particular incident that kind of is that tipping point for you, but that's just starting to uncrack it.
Yeah.
And then once, when you think, oh, I had it all figured out then a few months later, later, you're oh, wait, no, there's way more depth here.
Yep. Yeah. And you said
it's even darker than I thought. Fuck.
And you said something earlier while you were talking right there about being able to see in yourself or see in other people the parts of yourself. And so oftentimes our shadow reveals qualities that we can't stand in each other or in other people, but that we actually have within ourselves that we don't want to see. Okay? And so we're going to kind of do a little experiment here. Okay, and this is something that for those of you who have listened to the podcast or any of the ones that I've been on in the past, you guys also know that I work in prison systems. I work with violent offenders, but I also work with sex offenders. Now, the reason I'm going to use sex offenders is a really extreme example of this because first and foremost, everybody is very, they don't understand sex offending. And this isn't an attempt to make you understand it, but this is an attempt to illustrate how we take a moral high ground sometimes and we want to kind of judge and criticize everybody else without seeing those same factors within ourselves. And sex offenders are like the one thing where everybody's like, they're always like, oh no, I would never do that. That's never there. So I'm going to try and do this. And this is also a way to help elicit empathy, not for all sex offenders, but just to kind of gauge an example for what I'm talking about. So what I want to do.
We chose an extreme example so that we could,
yeah,
we weren't
to illustrate this.
Like,
right?
Oh, somebody robbed you. Like, no, this is an extreme example to illustrate this point.
Yeah. And so for those of you listening, you can kind of follow along. And for most of you, I think you'll agree with where this is going. So first of all, what I want to take a look at is...
In case anybody hasn't tuned out, now the 2.5 people have definitely turned off the podcast.
Like, what is sex offending? So, like, we'll break this down. Like, I'm going to ask you, Lauren. Would you agree that in order for somebody to commit a sex offense, it's at its basic core level, it's a violation of a person's rights?
Yes.
Okay. Would you also agree that there is a deliberate intention to hurt somebody?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that in order for a sex offense to occur, that there has to be no consideration or no care for the consequences of your actions?
Agreed.
Okay. Would we also agree that a sex offense is a very selfish act?
Agreed.
Okay, great. So that's essentially defining like what a sex offense is and what a person has done. Now, I will ask you this. Have you in your life ever been selfish?
Oh, no, of course not. Yes.
Okay. Have you ever done something regardless of the consequences or cared about the consequences?
100%.
Have you ever been deliberately intentional when you hurt someone?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Have you ever violated somebody else's rights?
I don't know about that, but I really thought about that question. I don't think so. Have I?
I don't know. Have you?
We're going to leave that one out.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I don't feel like I have.
I think that can be open for interpretation.
I was like, maybe that's an open for interpretation one.
But the point that I'm making is, while you're certainly not a sex offender, right? Let's make that clear.
Yeah.
You can empathize.
Thanks for clearing that up, Rick.
To a large degree, right? You can see within yourself many of the same aspects of something that you find repulsive about what other people do. And so the idea becomes, how do I learn to see myself within those actions, within what the person is doing, without necessarily judging it and incorporating it and integrating it? To achieve balance, right? To achieve balance, we work to integrate our shadow and balance that with our persona. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because if you think that you're above, I think the whole point of this is you're not above any act, right? Now, right. We're not saying that... Again, this was like the most extreme example and like egregious example that we could have picked, right? Mm-hmm. Outside of maybe some horrifying genocide. But, all of those things, we look at the end result and we think, well, I couldn't get there.
Right.
But those things generally don't happen with one step.
Right.
Right. And especially if we are talking about something like genocide, right? Like we'll transition to that, which is equally as awful, but very different. That wasn't one person deciding like, we're going to do this. It was a collective group of people who 1 inch moved forward and maybe did one thing that they didn't really like. Mm-hmm. And then did another. And then they kind of got numb to it. And then they did more. And all of this has been documented through all of European history in the 20th century, mm-hmm. over and over and over again. And if you can't recognize that you would do those things, well, then you are not recognizing these parts of yourself, because mm-hmm. all of us have that capacity.
Correct.
And understanding that capacity is how you can move through that and actually not do that, mm-hmm. right? Because if you are in denial that you can't do that, you're probably the person who is more likely going to do that and not even recognize it.
Right. You're seeing these things and you're saying, no way, this is me. So there's the repression. Mm-hmm. You're repressing the aspects of yourself that actually exist, the parts of you that are selfish, that don't care about the consequences, that can violate another person's rights, that are deliberate when hurting somebody. Those are just as much a part of you as they were this other person, but you're denying that aspect. You don't want to admit that that exists within you. So
until you do it, and then you're really taken aback, because when you've done something like that and then you recognize the extent of your actions, you can't really believe yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where a lot of people have a fallout, whether or not they recognize it in this capacity or not, but they've done something maybe they thought that they could never do. And then they saw how easily they could have done it and how easily that actually happens. And then you really have to question yourself, like, mm-hmm. wow, who the fuck am I that I did this, or that I could do this to somebody? And then for a lot of people, I would imagine that's what starts this journey. Maybe not. But maybe that also turns them down another path, right, where they either continue that behavior because they're like, wow, that was pretty easy, or they judge themselves so heavily and then they turn to other problematic behaviors to continue to repress that. So I feel like it can either be, it can open your eyes to this, or it can actually make that repression worse.
You can continue to reject aspects of who you are, which lead to shame. So it's possible, I think, for a lot of people, and perhaps even more tolerable for people, to recognize the evil of one person's own nature. However, it's very different to kind of gaze into the depths of that evil, of like a true evil. The evil that exists within all of us, like you were talking about the genocide. People are like, I could never do that. Like, yes, you can. It is in you. And I think when people
those people did that.
When you can recognize that it exists within you and that under the right circumstances you're capable of all of these atrocities, it also starts to open the door for forgiveness, which is a whole nother podcast, which is one that we've talked about doing. So
that's a really important topic.
It is. It's
especially in the context of this, because again, the chances of you feeling something so dark and awful that you don't think anybody else is feeling, which again is probably not true, but there's that capacity is there, whether you act on it or not, and you have to be able to forgive yourself if you have ever acted on that, because you're probably going to be faced with that at some point or another, and unless you're just going to live in either denial or repression and have a whole cascade of issues because of that, well, you need to learn to forgive yourself in that aspect as well.
Yep. Yeah. So the last part that I want to start getting into is the anima and the animus, and what these actually represent. In men, who are traditionally, men are masculine, there is an unconscious feminine aspect found in men called the anima. The anima is the personification of all feminine psychological tendencies, okay? And in women, who are traditionally feminine, there is an unconscious male aspect found in them called the animus. And the animus represents the personification of all masculine psychological tendencies. All right. Now, these two archetypes are probably they're further away from conscious awareness than the shadow is even. Okay. And people don't like to admit that, but they are.
Do you think that they're farther away from like a repression standpoint, or they're just higher concepts to understand, or both?
Probably both. Sometimes there's a reluctance for men to want to admit these qualities or aspects exist, or for people to truly recognize them within themselves. So for men, the anima is characterized by kind of those feminine qualities. And when they elicit the anima, oftentimes what they're looking to do is they're kind of like a child seeking the protective, nurturing role of a mother, right? And in women, the animus is characterized by those masculine qualities. And this is eliciting the principle of rationality, right? So like when we think about like maybe these are more like kind of older school ideas and concepts of like masculine, feminine energies, etc., where women are seen more as the protective, nurturing role, and men are seen more as like kind of the assertive, rational components.
Well, I don't even think that that's older roles. I think when we're talking about this, we're talking about the energy nature of it, not necessarily the gender.
Correct.
So it can still be applied no matter... I understand what you're saying, like when they were discussing all this 100 years ago or whatever, 80 years ago. It's a little different. But I would still say that this is still really applicable because it's talking about like the energy, and we have both of those within us regardless.
Right. So when a man is integrating his anima, he's giving way to a more caring figure in his life. When a woman is integrating her animus, she is allowing for more assertiveness and deliberation, right? She's becoming... I don't want to use the term more masculine, right? But that's essentially what they're saying. She's learning to assert herself, and men are learning to become more caring, nurturing, like less kind of the antithesis of what we consider the typical male and the typical female. They're learning to incorporate both. Like Gabor Mate talks about this. Somebody had asked him, actually I think I heard Jordan Peterson talking about it too, where somebody was asking him about the role of a father figure in a person's life, and that men fulfill these certain roles, and he said very blatantly to somebody like, no, fathers learn how to mother. And in that sentence is the concept of these two dynamics. Like a father can be nurturing and empathetic and caring and warm and soft and safe, and protective. And at the same time can still maintain all of the other traditional masculine roles. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting because these two will often materialize, these two concepts, these archetypes will often materialize in the way of dreams, and visions and fantasies. They're kind of the product of the unconscious, but they represent and they are present in every single person. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, these are difficult concepts for most people to kind of conceptualize and accept because oftentimes we're limited by what we think. Because usually for us, we only know what we're capable of thinking about and processing, and not necessarily thinking about concepts that are like stored in a collective unconscious of memories, ideas, behavioral patterns, traditions that have existed throughout mankind that aren't specific to me, that I might be controlled by. And so I guess the real point to kind of wrap this all up would be the continuous integration of the content from the collective unconscious and making them part of the self is done through therapy, introspection, that kind of moral fortitude, so to speak, to challenge your own beliefs. In doing this, it can have a considerable influence on yourself and your understanding of the world around you. And this also helps to create a stronger foundation for your psyche. And this is what helps people navigate and overcome their daily struggles, right? By becoming more aware of who you really are, it helps you manage the day-to-day difficulties and struggles that we all face, depression, anxiety. It starts to give more of a path to where it was, where it started, how do I incorporate this into my life, what are the strategies that I use to manage it, etc. So this is, I hope, whatever one person is still listening.
It's just like half a person at this point. It's just their shadow. They're like, yeah, more.
People are like, where's the macro accounting podcast again?
This guy's nuts. No, honestly, this, like I said, this is like my favorite stuff. And I think everybody reaches this at a different point, right? Mm-hmm. If they're willing, right? Not everybody, like I said, not everybody's willing to do this, which can also be hard, right? Like once you've started to go down this path, or even just become more introspective in general, I think that it can sometimes be hard when you see that other people aren't, right? Mm-hmm. Or you see how other people could benefit from this. But then you have to recognize, okay, I can't overlay my perceptions or my expectations of people, or my expectations onto other people, because that's not fair. Maybe they're not there, and maybe they don't want all this, right? Like wrestling with these ideas is not necessarily easy. And sometimes it can, I would say that the payoff is worth it. However, maybe it isn't for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. But if this is something that you have been feeling this pull towards, right? Or you're like, why do I keep repeating these patterns? Why do I keep doing this? Or, something comes up where you're really like, you feel like the bottom got pulled out and you're like, oh my gosh, how could I do this? Like, who am I? How did this happen? Or something really bad happens to you and you question, how could anybody do mm-hmm. this? Right? I feel like those are usually the two times where this comes up, unfortunately. But sometimes you need a situation like that to make you really sit and think with all these concepts. And like you said, this is a lifelong process. There's always another layer. There's always more depth. But recognizing all of these topics and, again, using a word, integrating them is really, really important, because otherwise, I don't know, I really don't see a way around this, to be honest, because I don't see a better explanation of how to work all of these things together, right? Like, I feel like this is the best packaged way to understand all of this, or one of the best, right? Maybe it's the best, but it's one of the best, because without this, it's like, what is the other alternative? You just deny things for the rest of your life? You just repress things for the rest of your life?
Yes, that's what people do.
Well, yeah, you can, but but that has consequences as well. But sometimes people don't want to recognize them, and then they project and blame others for their failures, which is really sad to see. But I guess if somebody is listening who maybe is starting this journey, right, to like understanding this, whether it's through their own introspection or therapy or both, but other people are in their life who, like I said, you want them maybe to do that, or you see that they're projecting, or you see that they're falling into these negative behaviors. Like, what would be a way to, I guess, accept that? I mean, or is that the answer? Like, you just have to accept that that is, because especially the projection one, right? That gets a lot of people. I talk to a lot of clients who, and this could be from small things to large things, but when people project their own insecurities and problems and issues, it's really hurtful and harmful to people. And, you know, I can say all day long, well, just don't let it affect you. Like, don't, ignore it. But ultimately that, you know, like, that still is bothersome. But is that really the best way to just accepting that it's more about that other person than it is about you?
Yeah, at a certain level, acceptance of the world and acceptance of others is a key concept to learning to not be bothered by other people. Like, here's an example of projection, and you tell me how many times you've seen this. Like, how many clients have you had where you're talking to them and you find out that their parents were obese or out of shape, and then like later found health and fitness, and it became the focal point of who they were, and so they kind of projected those insecurities around, you should never be more than this weight, you should never be this big. These are all kind, like, the kid didn't develop these things. These adults, your clients who are coming to you now are struggling with concepts that their parents projected onto them that were not a direct result of their experiences. And so I think sometimes, like I said, this is where, by doing some of this work, it can actually elicit empathy and a deeper understanding of who the other person was, and helping you accept that, and helping you integrate these things into your life, right? By knowing, like, these are the things that I've been unconsciously motivated by. These are the parts of me that I've repressed and didn't want to deal with, right?
That's a key point. Didn't want to deal with.
And now I can confront them in a space where I can deal with them. I'm strong enough. I can acknowledge that these parts of me exist and become a whole person, and not need to think of myself as some idealistic individual who just does everything for everybody else, and I'm no longer being authentic. That's where, like, people start doing all kinds of devious things, and it works itself out in horrible ways. If you don't give it the foundation for it to come out, it will. It's going to come out one way or another. It's just a matter of whether or not you can integrate it into a part of you in a healthy way, or whether you want to be ruled by it.
And giving yourself that space to do that is necessary for this change. Because if you just think that this is going to be like a casual thing that you just explore, or that you're going to work through, like, it's just not going to happen. So that's why there's different modalities, like we said, introspection, and whether that's just sitting with your thoughts or creating a space. Like, I talk about floating all the time. Like, literally, it's something that I've put myself in a position to where I go there and I know, okay, I'm going here for a specific reason. Here is this something that I'm going to think on. I'm, driving here. I know it's 60 minutes. I've paid to be here. I'm putting myself in the right headspace before this to do this. Journaling, going to therapy, whatever it is. Like, it's not going to be a casual endeavor to do this.
It won't be.
And you have to give yourself the space. But if you just keep running around and around and around and around and just pushing it away, like you said, it's going to come out in a really negative way that can harm other people or yourself, or both.
Yeah, exactly.
So for anybody who's still listening, we hope that you enjoyed this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed this episode. So if you did, please share it. That is the best way to support our show and get more, 2 more listeners, because I know that everybody is so jazzed up about this. Promise we'll go back to our more normal topics from here on out. But honestly, if you would like to hear more about this, also let us know. You can drop a question below in the anonymous link in the show notes. And for more information on therapy with Rick, I will also put his contact information below. You can visit our website, teamlocofit.com, to find out about coaching, and to also join our email list to be the first to hear about our app that's coming out in the next few months. So yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time.